The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Maple Street, painting the quiet residential neighborhood in golden hues that seemed to promise peace. But peace, as we often discover, can be shattered by the simplest of assumptions, the quickest of judgments, the deepest of fears we carry without even knowing they exist. Dr. Elijah Brooks adjusted his rearview mirror one more time, catching a glimpse of his hospital identification badge, swaying gently as it hung from the metal hook. The badge bore his photograph, a kind face with intelligent eyes that had seen too much suffering, hands that had pulled countless people back from the brink of death, and a smile that had comforted families in their darkest hours. But none of that mattered to the woman across the street, who was watching him through her living room window, her fingers already reaching for her phone. Elijah had been making this same stop for months. 3 blocks from Central Memorial Hospital, Maple Street offered the perfect sanctuary for a tired doctor who needed just 45 minutes of rest before beginning another grueling 12-hour night shift in the emergency room. His Honda Civic, now 5 years old but meticulously maintained, had become his mobile refuge. The back seat held the tools of his trade, freshly laundered scrubs folded with military precision, a small cooler containing his dinner, medical journals he never seemed to have time to read, and a worn leather bag that had belonged to his father, also a doctor, who had passed away when Elijah was still in medical school. The neighborhood was the kind of place where children rode bicycles on sidewalks lined with mature oak trees, where American flags hung from front porches, and where everyone supposedly knew everyone else. It was also the kind of place where a black man sitting quietly in a car could become the subject of suspicion simply by existing in that space. Rachel Montgomery had lived on Maple Street for 15 years. She considered herself a good neighbor, the kind of person who brought casseroles to new families and organized the annual block party. She recycled religiously, donated to charity, and had even attended a diversity workshop at her company the previous year. But as she peered through her sheer curtains at the unfamiliar car parked across from her house, something deep in her subconscious began to whisper warnings that she didn't even recognize as bias. The man in the car was black. She didn't recognize him. She didn't recognize the vehicle. In her mind, these facts combined to create a narrative of potential threat that felt as real as the coffee mug warming her hands. She told herself she was being cautious, responsible even. She told herself that any good citizen would do the same thing. She told herself that race had nothing to do with it, even as she dialed 911 with trembling fingers. 911, what's your emergency? There's a suspicious man sitting in a car on my street, Rachel said, her voice tight with anxiety she couldn't quite name. He's been there for a while, and I don't know what he's doing. He doesn't belong in this neighborhood. The dispatcher's questions came quickly. What was the man doing? Did she see any weapons? Any signs of immediate danger? Rachel's answers revealed the truth. There was no crime, no threat, no actual emergency. Just a man sitting in a car. But the wheels were already in motion. Meanwhile, Elijah had set his phone alarm for 6:45 p.m., giving himself just enough time to wake up, gather his thoughts, and make the short drive to the hospital. He had learned long ago that these brief interludes of rest were essential for maintaining the mental clarity required in emergency medicine. Too many doctors burned out from exhaustion, making mistakes that cost lives. Elijah refused to be one of them, especially given how hard he had worked to get where he was. His journey to becoming a doctor had not been easy. Growing up in a working-class family in Detroit, he had watched his mother work double shifts as a nurse while his father struggled to establish his own small medical practice in an underserved community. Money was always tight, but education was never negotiable. His parents had sacrificed everything to ensure that their son would have opportunities they never had. When Elijah graduated summa cum laude from Howard University and was accepted to Harvard Medical School, his father had cried tears of joy and pride. Now, at 34, Elijah was one of the most respected emergency physicians at Central Memorial. He had published research papers, mentored medical students, and volunteered his time at free clinics. His colleagues trusted him with the most complex cases, and his patients often requested him specifically. But none of that professional accomplishment could protect him from what was about to happen on this quiet Tuesday evening. The first patrol car arrived without sirens, but the flashing red and blue lights immediately transformed the peaceful street into something that felt dangerous and urgent. The second car followed within minutes. Elijah jerked awake to the sound of heavy footsteps approaching his vehicle and the harsh white glare of a flashlight cutting through his window. "Sir, I need you to step out of the vehicle with your hands visible," the first officer commanded, his hand resting on his weapon. Confusion and adrenaline flooded Elijah's system as he tried to orient himself. He had been dreaming of his childhood home, of Sunday dinners with his extended family, of laughter and safety. Now he was surrounded by flashing lights and stern voices, and the familiar weight of dread settled in his stomach like a stone. "I'm a doctor," he said as he slowly opened the car door, making sure his movements were deliberate and non-threatening. Years of being a black man in America had taught him this choreography of survival. "I work at Central Memorial Hospital, just 3 blocks from here. I was resting before my shift." He reached carefully for his hospital identification badge, the same one that had been swaying from his rearview mirror just moments before. The plastic card contained all the proof anyone should need: his photograph, his title, his department, the hospital's official seal. But the officers barely glanced at it. "Why are you parked here?" the second officer asked, his tone suggesting that any answer would be insufficient. "I often rest here before my night shifts," Elijah explained, fighting to keep his voice calm and respectful despite the humiliation burning in his chest. "I've been doing this for months. I start work at 7, and I need to be alert for my patients." But explanations seemed to fall on deaf ears. More questions followed, each one more invasive than the last. Why wasn't he parked at the hospital? Why this particular street? Did he have any drugs in the car? Any weapons? Any criminal history? Elijah answered each question with the patience of a man who had endured this type of interrogation before, though never quite like this. He pointed to his medical bag, to his scrubs neatly folded in the back seat, to his hospital parking pass visible on his dashboard. He offered to call his supervisor, Dr. Patricia Williams, who could vouch for his character and his routine. "If you are enjoying this story, kindly do us a favor and subscribe to our channel. It is free and won't cost anything, but it means a lot to us. We are just a small channel trying to grow. Thank you." And back to the video. 23 minutes passed. 23 minutes during which Elijah stood on a public street, surrounded by police cars with flashing lights, while neighbors emerged from their homes to watch the spectacle. 23 minutes during which his professional reputation, his personal dignity, and his basic humanity were questioned simply because a woman across the street had seen a black man and felt afraid. Finally, without apology or acknowledgement, the officers returned to their vehicles and drove away. No citation was issued because no crime had been committed. No arrest was made because no law had been broken. But damage had been done nonetheless, the kind of damage that lives in the space between what is legal and what is right, between what is procedural and what is just. Elijah sat in his car for several minutes after the police left, his hands shaking slightly as he gripped the steering wheel. Across the street, he could see Rachel Montgomery's silhouette in her window, though she quickly stepped away when she realized he was looking in her direction. He wondered if she felt satisfied, vindicated, or perhaps just relieved that the threat had been neutralized. He wondered if she even recognized that she had just participated in the violation of an innocent man's dignity. The drive to Central Memorial took less than 5 minutes, but it felt like an eternity. Elijah parked in his assigned spot in the hospital garage, gathered his belongings, and walked through the familiar corridors toward the emergency department. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, and the antiseptic smell that had once been comforting now seemed harsh and clinical. He nodded to colleagues, responded to greetings, and prepared for his shift with the professionalism that had been drilled into him since medical school. But underneath his calm exterior, the encounter on Maple Street had left him feeling raw and exposed. The emergency room at Central Memorial was a microcosm of human drama, where life and death decisions were made every hour of every day. It was a place where socioeconomic barriers disappeared in the face of medical crisis, where the homeless man with pneumonia received the same level of care as the wealthy businessman with chest pain. It was also the place where Elijah felt most like himself, competent, necessary, valued. Dr. Patricia Williams, the department chief, noticed something different in Elijah's demeanor during their brief handoff meeting, but the pace of the emergency room didn't allow for personal conversations. A multi-vehicle accident on the interstate was sending several trauma cases their way, and every available physician would be needed. At 11:47 p.m., the ambulance bay doors burst open with urgency that made everyone in the department look up from their current tasks. The paramedics wheeled in a stretcher carrying a woman in her mid-40s, her face swollen and discolored from impact, her breathing labored and irregular. The lead paramedic rattled off vital signs and injury assessments as they moved rapidly toward Trauma Bay 3. Female, approximately 45 years old, victim of a single-vehicle rollover accident on Highway 65, the paramedic reported. Possible traumatic brain injury, multiple rib fractures, suspected internal bleeding, blood pressure dropping, pulse steady and rapid. Elijah moved into action with the fluid precision that had made him legendary among the nursing staff. His personal troubles dissolved as his training took over, as the sacred responsibility of his profession consumed his entire being. This was what he'd been born to do, to stand between death and the people who were not ready to meet it. "Let's get her to her too," he called out, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had guided hundreds of similar cases. "I need 2 units of O-negative blood, and get Dr. Martinez from neurosurgery down here immediately." As they prepared to move the patient, her eyelids fluttered open for just a moment. Through the haze of pain and trauma, she looked directly at Elijah's face. Recognition flickered in her eyes, not the recognition of a patient seeing her doctor, but something deeper and more troubling. It was Rachel Montgomery. The woman who had called the police on him just hours earlier was now lying broken and bleeding on his trauma table, her life hanging in the balance. The irony was not lost on Elijah, but it didn't slow his hands or cloud his judgment for even a second. His oath as a physician was clear. First, do no harm. Help those who need help. Save lives without discrimination or prejudice. Rachel tried to speak, perhaps to apologize, perhaps to express her shock at this twist of fate. But the anesthesia was already taking effect as they prepared her for emergency surgery, and her words were lost in the controlled chaos of life-saving medicine. For the next 4 hours, Dr. Elijah Brooks worked with extraordinary skill and dedication to repair the damage that a moment of inattention on a dark highway had caused to the woman who had seen him as a threat. He stopped internal bleeding, stabilized fractures, and monitored brain activity with the same meticulous care he would have given to anyone. His colleagues assisted without knowing the backstory, seeing only a gifted surgeon doing what he did best. The surgery was successful. Rachel Montgomery would live, would recover, would return to her house on Maple Street with its American flag and well-maintained garden. But she would also carry with her the knowledge of what grace looked like when delivered by hands she had feared. When Rachel woke up in the recovery room the next morning, sunlight was streaming through the window, painting everything in the same golden hues that had colored Maple Street the evening before. She felt the familiar disorientation that follows major surgery, but as her vision cleared, she saw Dr. Brooks standing at the foot of her bed, reviewing her chart with the quiet professionalism that characterized everything he did. Their eyes met, and the weight of the previous evening's events settled between them like a heavy blanket. Rachel's eyes filled with tears, tears of gratitude, shame, and recognition, all combined into something she couldn't quite name. "Dr. Brooks," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I'm so sorry. I didn't know. I didn't think." Elijah looked at her with the same compassionate expression he gave to all his patients, understanding without judgment, professional without being cold. "The important thing is that you're going to be okay," he said simply. "Your recovery is going to take time, but you're going to be fine." She reached out toward him, perhaps hoping for absolution, perhaps needing human connection in that vulnerable moment. He allowed her to briefly touch his hand, gave her a small, reassuring smile, and then returned his attention to her medical chart. There would be time for larger conversations later, but in that moment, his role was clear. He was her doctor, and she was his patient. Word of the incident spread through the hospital with the speed that only gossip can achieve. An anonymous nurse, heartbroken and angry over what had happened to a colleague she deeply respected, shared the story on social media. Within hours, it had been picked up by local news outlets, and by the end of the week, the story of Dr. Elijah Brooks had become a national conversation about bias, grace, and the better angels of human nature. Reporters gathered outside Central Memorial, eager to interview the doctor who had saved the life of the woman who had called the police on him. Elijah initially declined all interviews, preferring to let his actions speak for themselves. But as the story continued to grow, and as he realized the platform it provided to address issues he cared deeply about, he agreed to hold a press conference. Standing behind a podium bristling with microphones, Dr. Elijah Brooks faced a room full of cameras and journalists. He had prepared remarks, but in the moment, he spoke from his heart about the complexities of bias, the power of professional duty, and the choice every person has to rise above their worst impulses. If you are enjoying this story, kindly do us a favor and subscribe to our channel. It is free and won't cost anything, but it means a lot to us. We are just a small channel trying to grow. Thank you. And back to the video. What happened to me on Tuesday evening happens to people who look like me more often than it should, he began, his voice steady and clear. But this story isn't really about me, and it's not really about blame. It's about the moment we all face when we have to choose between our biases and our better selves. He paused, looking directly into the cameras that would carry his words to millions of people across the country. Bias doesn't always announce itself with hatred or violence, he continued. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it makes phone calls. Sometimes it convinces us that our fear is the same thing as wisdom. But grace is the choice to do the right thing even when you've been wronged. Grace is saving a life because that's what you've sworn to do, regardless of who that life belongs to. The questions from reporters were predictable. How did he feel when he recognized his patient? Was he tempted to let someone else handle the case? Did he expect an apology? Elijah answered each question with the same measured thoughtfulness, always bringing the conversation back to the larger issues of implicit bias and the professional responsibilities that transcend personal grievances. After the press conference, Elijah walked through the hospital parking garage to his car, the same Honda Civic that had been the center of so much controversy. As he approached the vehicle, he was surprised to find his mother waiting for him, having driven down from Detroit after seeing the news coverage. Dr. Evelyn Brooks was 72 years old, a retired nurse who had raised her son to believe that education and character were the only weapons powerful enough to fight injustice. She embraced her son tightly, and for a moment, the accomplished emergency physician became simply a child seeking comfort from his mother. "I'm proud of you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Your father would have been proud too. You did exactly what he would have done." As they stood together in the garage, mother and son, the weight of generations of struggle and progress seemed to settle around them. Elijah's grandfather had been denied admission to medical school because of his race. His father had faced discrimination throughout his career, but had never let it diminish his commitment to healing. Now Elijah carried that legacy forward, adding his own chapter to a story of resilience and grace. That evening, Elijah drove home through the same streets where he had been questioned and humiliated just days before. As he passed Maple Street, he could see lights on in Rachel Montgomery's house, where she was presumably continuing her recovery. He wondered if she was watching the news coverage, if she was reflecting on her role in the story, if she understood the lesson that had emerged from their unlikely intersection. The story of Dr. Elijah Brooks and Rachel Montgomery became more than just a news item. It became a mirror that forced people to examine their own assumptions and biases. In schools and churches, in offices and community centers, people discussed what they would have done in Rachel's position, what they would have done in Elijah's position, and what the story revealed about the society. they were all creating together. Some people criticized Rachel Montgomery, calling her actions racist and inexcusable. Others defended her, arguing that she was simply being cautious in an uncertain world. But the most thoughtful discussions focused on the complexity of bias, how it operates below the level of conscious thought, how it can coexist with good intentions, and how it can be overcome through education, exposure, and empathy. Dr. Elijah Brooks returned to his normal routine at Central Memorial Hospital, but he was forever changed by the experience. He began speaking at medical schools about the intersection of bias and healthcare, helping future doctors understand how their own assumptions could affect patient care. He also started a community outreach program that brought medical professionals into neighborhoods to provide education and build trust between communities and healthcare institutions. Rachel Montgomery also became an advocate, though her journey was more private and personal. She joined diversity education programs, volunteered with organizations working to address racial bias, and had difficult conversations with friends and family about the assumptions they all carried. She never publicly discussed her experience, but those who knew her saw a profound change in how she moved through the world. The story could have ended with anger, resentment, and division. Instead, it became a testament to the possibility of redemption and growth. Dr. Elijah Brooks could have walked away from Rachel Montgomery's case, and no one would have blamed him. He could have been bitter, vindictive, or cold. Instead, he chose grace. In a world that often seems divided by fear and mistrust, the story of Dr. Brooks reminds us that we all have the capacity to rise above our worst impulses. We all carry biases, some learned in childhood, some absorbed from society, some buried so deep we convince ourselves they don't exist. But what we do with those biases, how we choose to act when confronted with their limitations, that's what defines our character. The next time you see someone who doesn't look like you, who doesn't belong to your community, who makes you feel inexplicably uncomfortable, remember Dr. Elijah Brooks. Remember that the person you're looking at might be the same person who could save your life someday. Remember that grace is not just a gift we give to others. It's a gift we give to ourselves, freeing us from the prison of prejudice and fear. This is more than just a story about one doctor and one patient. It's a story about all of us, about the society we're building together, about the choice we face every day between our biases and our better angels. Dr. Elijah Brooks chose grace. The question is, what will you choose?